On November 4th, 2011, IBM trademarked the phrase smarter city. It was an effort by a technology company to control the language of urban development. For 10 years before that, cities such as San Diego, San Francisco, Ottawa, Amsterdam, Kyoto, Bangalore had claimed to be smart cities, and now IBM wanted in on the action.
Okay, so you're going to have to stop this story, Holland, because of course, come on. All cities want to be called smart cities. Who wouldn't want to be called a smart city? No city is going to want to be designated as a dumb city. So when you say that San Diego and Kyoto and Bangalore were calling themselves smart, what do you mean? Did the people there have a higher IQ or what?
IBM actually defined the phrase smart cities. They say the core of any smart city lies in three I's: instrumented, interconnected, and intelligent.
Interesting. There's another I for you. What does that mean?
Instrumented refers to the capability of capturing and integrating live, real-world data through the use of sensors. Interconnected refers to the integration of data into a computing platform that allows the communication of information among various city services. And intelligent refers to the inclusion of complex analytics and artificial intelligence to make better decisions.
Okay, so basically, smart cities integrate machine-to-machine technology in both deep and a broad way in order to improve the lives of their citizens.
Exactly, and it may affect what you read, how much you read, and what the citizens in your city have access to read.
Interesting. Again, another I. Well, to talk about that, we have invited Noah Schumerth, an urban geographer with a deep love of literature, and George Fletcher, an engineer who now serves on the Greenville City Council.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Bolin.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. I met Noah when we got into an argument on Twitter about why people read what they do. And he was so smart, I knew we had to have him on the podcast. Noah just graduated with a major in geography from Calvin College. He's headed to Arizona State University for a master's in urban planning. He's now working as a comprehensive planner in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and has previously worked in the city of Appleton, the Neighborhood Development Office, and the Christian Community Development Association. Noah's interested in how collective civic action promotes the common good in urban planning, especially around public spaces such as libraries.
Wonderful. Well, George Fletcher is the at-large representative for the city of Greenville. He was formerly executive director for the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness, an economic development nonprofit. He is a professional engineer and for almost 30 years was the principal owner of various engineering and environmental management companies. He has a strong interest in smart city initiatives and how they will impact the future.
All right. So welcome, George and Noah. Let's start from the ground up here. We gave what we learned from our research as the definition of a smart city. But in plain language, George, what is a smart city?
Well, your definition is pretty good. Smart city technology generally refers to the collection and processing of just enormous amounts of data. The data is collected from people, from devices, and city assets in order to better manage public services. Talking about smart cities in terms of data management usually gets a big yawn from my constituents. However, I was at a conference in Austin, Texas in 2016 where they announced the winner of the $40 million DOT Smart City Grant, which went to, by the way, Columbus, Ohio. The amazing thing to me was when I walked into the exhibit hall, and there were the largest companies on earth, the AT&T, Cisco, GE, Google, IBM, Siemens, Verizon. And Cisco was there talking about 20.8 billion interconnected devices by 2020 and what they believe will be a $30 trillion market. I don't believe that we can spend that kind of money without having it fundamentally change almost everything cities do.
Right. This is kind of the fun part here, defining a smart city. Every community is going to look different in terms of how they define being a smart city. Everywhere you look, you see different definitions, all revolving around the development of widespread technology in urban development. particularly digital and communications-based technology. But it doesn't get you very far for a definition. In fact, you can end up with competing definitions pretty easily. Take these two that I just read the other day. One is the intersection of digital technology, disruptive innovation in urban environments, and the other, a place where traditional networks and services can be made more efficient with the use of digital and telecommunications technology. Do you see the conflict? Is this a supplement to the existing ways of city building and urban design, or is it a completely revolutionary path to how cities plan and grow? It really depends who you're talking to. And so, in short, it's really quite a vague term, in part because it's also future-oriented. It's so speculative about the future of where our cities are going to go. So I really see it as kind of three distinctive definitions. A city that, like you said earlier, is really instrumented with technology and is constantly providing feedback through technology. I've also seen it as a specific neighborhood or development with a deeper integration of technology. Or it's actually, where I've seen it most commonly, a cultural or visionary identity for where a city wants to go. So I'm inclined to believe most people are thinking about the third when they're talking about smart cities. And maybe that's just because I'm a comprehensive planner and I'm thinking more about city vision and where people are going. I think that's how people use it generally.
There's almost an evolutionary aspect to it where one thing at a time is being changed because of this marvelous new data management. Let me give you just one example. All over the country, they're beginning to use adaptive stoplights, which are stoplights that are connected all together across the whole city, but each individual stoplight would have a camera that reads the traffic, feeds it into a central database. If there's no cross traffic, it doesn't change. You know, that's the sort of thing that people are going to be seeing far sooner than later. Very practical aspects of some of this smart city technology.
That helps a little bit, and I appreciate both of you coming up with that idea. And I think the word, though, that strikes me a little bit, Noah, is the word disruptive. And so what does smart city identity, cultural identity, I appreciate that word also, what does it look like in a city like, George, we're talking about Greenville, or a city like Milwaukee? What does that look like? No, I'm going to ask you first.
Yes, I think there's a massive variety when it comes to strategies for creating these smart cities. You mentioned the word disruptive, and I would say right now these strategies come in much smaller forms, ways that are accessible for public governments, which have very limited budgets to install, or private companies to invest in to make maybe existing investments more efficient. And I don't think a lot of the improvements are foreign to urban residents either. I think they're things that are becoming increasingly common to everyday life in the city. So an example where this is true is in transportation. So transportation has really gotten out ahead of a lot of other areas of the city in terms of the integration of data and technology and smart city technology in everyday life. So, for example, transit users utilize it every day. You know, you have timers for trains and buses in real time, which requires some sort of GPS or some sort of continuous data exchange between the bus and the user interface. You have on-time performance data, ridership counting, streetlight timers, these small tweaks that rely on this continual exchange of data that make an enormous difference in terms of how people use transit. Ask Seattle or Salt Lake City, two really successful transit systems that became successful because of these smaller additions, I think, to everyday use of those systems. And more prominently, when it comes to disruption, I think you start to see that with ride sharing and the possibility of autonomous vehicles, which in full disclosure, I'm immensely skeptical of for reasons that I could bore you about all day. But they're set to use this continuous streaming of data and user interface like apps to radically change the way that we use cars. I think you see a lot of that beginning to be talked about at the level of city government, which is where a lot of the changes to our transportation systems are going to start to happen. So I think, though, in terms of disruption, and if you don't mind me going on one more point here, I think there's a lot of it is the infrastructure you don't see. the ability to collect and, more importantly, manage data internally. This comes through all kinds of programs and not just ones built specifically for data management. So, for example, GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, allows for data to be analyzed so easily and to be applied to maps or things that people can understand. It makes it possible to turn all those little ridership numbers on a bus line into something far more easily understood than just a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet. And it really opens up the public to learn more about their cities and perhaps become more literate about the way that they work than ever before.
I agree with Noah on that one. I got off the Salt Lake City transit system about an hour ago. It's a marvelous system. And little things as we speak, the parking garages. I mean, where you can look on your telephone and see how many spaces are available in a parking garage. And you do away with the gates. So you drive in, it reads your license plate. It automatically bills you when you drive out. Those kinds of changes are taking place. I'd like to comment, one, on the disruptive, and maybe we can get into a debate sometime in the future about autonomous vehicles. BMW had an international conference in 2017 in Germany, and they called it ACES, Autonomous, Connected, Electric, and Shared. And the premise of that conference was that today there are 15 original equipment manufacturers, car manufacturers around the world. By 2025, there's going to be 6. And if you don't deal with the issue of autonomous, connected, electric, and shared, you will not be one of the 6. And that's disruptive.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, appreciate that.
I mean, if you get out of my more mundane circle in the public sector, there's some pretty insane proposals that are showing how soon it will be until smart cities really move from kind of these smaller systems that we've mentioned, like, license plate readers or real-time, bus data or things like that, until they become these large-scale, I would say, true smart communities. One example is in Toronto right now. It's pretty controversial. It's called the Sidewalk Labs, and it's being proposed by Alphabet, the kind of overarching company over Google. So it's this infamous project that's being proposed on Lake Ontario. There's hundreds of acres of land devoted to Google's experimentation with smart city technology. For $4 billion of upfront investment, they're pushing the limits on all fronts of smart city building. You've got these automated delivery dollies, universal broadband and internet access. Every bit of every building has sensors that are able to take every little bit of data you can imagine. Even the construction of the structures on the property is going to be closely monitored for efficiency. They're trying this whole new type of building, like wooden skyscrapers, that requires a level of close monitoring and analysis that only the smart city era can provide. And so that being said, I think that the level of disruption and changes that you see to the way that cities work, I think that's going to really become prominent in the next 10 to 15 years as some of these really large-scale proposals really start to become realities.
And the reason for that data management investment is that 40% of our total energy costs us in heating and cooling buildings.
Right.
Well, let's move just a little bit now and let's think about libraries in the context of smart cities, because what we're interested in on this podcast is talking about these things that are happening in the world, what we think of as macro trends, and how they're going to impact reading and literacy. So keeping smart city development in mind, libraries are venerable institutions in many cities. Are we missing opportunities in engaging adults with why libraries are important and providing services that advance innovation in cities in those public spaces like libraries and museums? Shall we start with you, Noah, and then maybe George can give his response after that?
Sure. So my hometown, which I love, in Appleton, Wisconsin, is currently working on planning a beautiful new library structure. It's a mixed-use building, so you've got the library on the ground floor and apartments on the upper floors. I can't tell you the number of comments, though, that I've read about the project that go exactly like this. Why do we need it? The library's dead, just old books. No one will be reading in a few years anyways. Don't we have e-readers? And I think many people see libraries as serving a single use, storing books and information in a paper format. This is especially true for people who don't necessarily use the library often, and they imagine these places as stuffy, empty public spaces. But I don't think that could be further from the truth. Today, I go to the Brown County Library in Green Bay every morning to get coffee at their co-working space. It's called Rise and Grind. It's an innovation unto itself for a city of 100,000. But the library is always buzzing with life, and that life rarely has to do only with books. There's workshops, there's classes, tours being hosted. There's so many educational opportunities available through a library that few people get to see.
I think you're going to see libraries become increasingly more specialized. Think of medical libraries where a given doctor can access 12,000 cases or something similar, and by plugging in specific bits of data, Watson can go through the 12,000 cases and pull out those that might be relevant to what he's doing. I was yesterday at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, which is the largest collection of genealogical data on Earth. And it was just phenomenal. You walk in and it looks like a casino of computer screens. I found out I was the seventh cousin 10 times removed of George Washington. I'm thrilled. Can't wait to use it in my campaign.
There you go.
But, just plugging in on a register, I put in a couple of names, and all of a sudden it was populated by stuff back to the 1800s of people I'd never even heard of. So I think some specialization in libraries will occur because of the big data.
Yeah, and so what I really imagine libraries in the smart cities era doing is, I think, really changing the way we think about public institutions like public libraries. An example that I would use is, so we see K-12 education as a meaningful public good, right? It prepares little munchkins for jobs and life as citizens. But we don't see education for adults as a meaningful public good, even though we constantly complain how the world is speeding up and new technology and ideas are coming up all the time. That's one of the main themes of the smart city, right, is constantly innovating, constantly improving. I know, Holland, I think you mentioned that earlier in the podcast. So with that emphasis on continual improvement and efficiency, I think that can really take on a human element through libraries. I think libraries stand as the best place to really get adults who can quickly fall behind in that economy that's constantly focused on innovation. I think they can really connect them to continuous improvement themselves as people, kind of learning new skills, being trained. I think libraries can serve a really important function there. And that can really add resilience to a city in the face of technological disruption. I'm definitely not suggesting that people become machines or try to copy some of those themes of innovation. But I think to realize any of these lofty goals of a smart city, I think you need people who are able to keep up with technology, able to think deeply about technology, and able to innovate and problem solve, especially once they're out of school and in the workforce. And I think libraries can serve that role really, really well.
I think a whole lot of organizations are and have to serve that role. I take exception to the fact that we're not worrying about continuing education of adults. I think that is, the professions, the technical colleges, I think that's an ongoing, forever kind of a circumstance.
One of the things that I just came from a tech conference, we have an upstate technology conference, and one of the things that they were talking about is the use of libraries as locations for adult education. And I really appreciate, especially in our topic of smart cities, one of the comments was, and maybe, George, you might be familiar with this program through the Department of Education. It's called SC Codes, and it's a nonprofit free site that supports and helps adults and young people learn how to code and program. And they do this through many of the public spaces like their libraries. But one of the things that is a requirement, especially in some of these digital deserts, is having broadband, having access to the internet so that people can access this technology. So I appreciate the idea of bringing this idea of smart technology into a city that will now maybe not disrupt, will enhance and support further education. Because one of the things we do know, a large population of our cities, they don't have access to public goods like broadband and things like that that might be supportive. They may not have access to a public library. If smart technology acted as a barrier rather than a means of access, how will smart cities make libraries more accessible for everyone? And that's one of the themes that Holland and I keep hearing over and over is this access. So, George, what do you think smart cities will do to help alleviate some of that digital desert issues that we might be facing?
Well, it's a huge problem. But let me go back a step. First place, the cities are doing very little with distributing broadband. This is all being driven by the private sector through AT&T and Verizon. And if you start talking about 5G networks, where you're going to have to put small cells every 1,200 feet, and they're just deploying them all over the country now, the impact of those small cells and the faster, it's just a bigger pipeline for data. The impact's going to be enhanced robotics, enhanced displacement of service shops. I mean, not only in plants, but in restaurants and all kinds of occupations. And that's scary. I mean, already there's a growing disparity between the rich and poor, and I do believe that's going to make it worse. And we're going to have to figure out ways. We are trying to concentrate on the digital desert and putting that as part of the franchise agreements when AT&T or Verizon or somebody comes in and wants a franchise. The problem is not just the digital desert, the problem's paying for it.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Amy, I'm actually going to flip your question around backwards because I think we can have a really interesting conversation in that direction too. How do libraries make smart cities more accessible? And that's a question I've been thinking about a lot, especially when it comes to equity. And so I think that there's a massive class divide when it comes to talking about smart cities, which I think keeps them sometimes more as a visionary ideal in terms of something that really all works together, and something that will really struggle to gain traction in its truest forms, at least the form that I think tech companies in some cities really imagine them taking on. And I think libraries can really help bridge that class divide. Because I know you have people, particularly wealthy people, who are able to pick up any piece of technology and know how to use it well. I would probably say that because I've grown up in that world, I'm one of those people. It's amazing how fast people can pick up new technological skills today. But to be able to pick that up, you need to have the basics down, from internet use to basic Microsoft programs, for example, that I learned in school because I'm fairly young, and so this was what was pretty commonplace by the time I was in high school. But not everybody has access to that. And this is where I think libraries can offer a lot of help and really provide a kind of baseline for people to make sure that they have access to the skills they need to get involved in kind of smart city innovation. Right now they offer classes on the most basic topics in technology use, which might seem silly to somebody who knows how to use all these devices, but it can have huge impacts on someone's ability to enter the workforce or even navigate a city. In today's world. I think if we reframe libraries this way and, really brand libraries this way, I think it'll go a long way towards, in allowing everyone to participate in kind of smart city growth, and also can really keep people from, I would say, falling out of the system and kind of falling behind, because I think smart cities do have an ability to really exacerbate existing class divides, those kind of haves and have-nots. And I think that, again, libraries can really be a way that the public sector can really make sure that there's some sort of baseline so people are getting the basic skills they need to navigate the future of cities. And so that's how I kind of flip that question around.
I don't want to disparage libraries, but I've dedicated a water system in Honduras in a mountain area where people are living in grass shacks and had no power. And half the kids around that dedication ceremony had cell phones. And they powered them by solar. Most of the poor kids in Greenville have got cell phones. I mean, I think the access is there. The question is, how do you teach them? You've got the world's knowledge in your pocket. Physically going to a library is not necessary, but if the libraries can outreach through the phone to connect, that's what we need to be looking at.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point, especially for the future. I guess I'm looking at from my experience here. I guess we have a large number of especially older people who didn't grow up like say the kids in Honduras that you saw with cell phones, where they don't have even the basic technological skills. Many of them don't. Like those classes that I mentioned are really well attended. And so that's a really tricky generational divide, I think. Libraries.
So you're talking about are you talking about older people?
Right. So people who are probably, I would say, 30 and up, who haven't grown, who grew up in an era before, this massive disruption of cell phones and widespread computer access and widespread internet access beyond dial-up and things like that.
I've survived the 60s twice, and I don't know of anybody that doesn't have a cell phone.
Right. And I think both of your points are very tangent. But one of the things I will remark on as a teacher and as a teacher who also taught educational technology, there is one person who knows how to pick up a cell phone and use it. And then there is another person who knows how to integrate that technology. And I think we're talking two different things here because, George, you're absolutely right. We know how to use a cell phone. And Noah, you're right. We have a generation of people who are not digital natives and they don't necessarily understand how to integrate that technology. So I think we're talking two sides of the same coin.
Well, I think it's more than digital or a generational divide. I mean, when I taught school, the students I had are about 22 now. So they had grown up with technology, the internet. They had cell phones in their pockets, exactly like you're talking about, George. And so they had that access. If you want to go in and find it, you can. But what was interesting to me is anytime I would assign something and we would go to the internet, they didn't even know how to frame a question and put it into Google. I mean, they could type words into Google, but they didn't know how to frame a question in order to get meaningful results. And then how to sort through it and determine what's a legitimate source and what's not. So it's almost a problem of too much information packed into these little devices and in our pockets and not enough ability to sort through all that information and find something useful in it. And I wonder if we are going to rely on distributed technology to bring knowledge from a central library source into people's pockets, people are going to have to be retrained out of the way we think about searching for information to search for it differently. Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
It's a valid point. I think people I'm talking about are not at all comfortable with social media, but they are pretty comfortable with chasing things on the internet. The internet, for people my age, is the most astounding technological advance in our lifetimes. I mean, to have thought that you could go to college, 50 years ago and have the world's knowledge in your shirt pocket is astounding. But I think people have to have the need to want to learn, and that's maybe what we need to be promoting through libraries.
Right. And I think that's the point maybe, Noah, you were trying to come to, is that having a central location like a library has the opportunity to mentor this technology. So I think that's what I'm hearing. We want to be able to use this technology well. And I think libraries can be a bridge to that digital divide, whether it's just because I need to know how to formulate a question better, or I don't even know how to turn the silly thing on, and so.
I think there's a really interesting point buried in here that I think is worth talking about, and it has to do with kind of the democratization of knowledge, which I think has been a really big theme with the cell phone era, right? We have incredible amounts of information just pouring into our pockets all the time. It's just revolutionary, the amount of information that I can glean from just picking up my phone and Google searching something. But I really think there was a really good point stated earlier where it's such an onslaught of information, and it's not information that it can be really effectively turned into something meaningful unless you know how to ask the right questions, unless you know how to really integrate it into problem solving or into bigger questions that have been going on. I think the library as a centralizing institution, as that mentoring institution, as you mentioned, can be really helpful, because I think there are limits to the way in which we democratize knowledge. There has to be some kind of anchoring institution that not only serves as an information repository, like we kind of see libraries today, but is able to, like you said, mentor people through that information, host ways to connect information and viewpoints that we develop and things like that to broader conversations and to bigger questions.
Well, let's hold on that question, Noah, because you know what? We might want to talk about that in just a minute, because you're leading us right into an excellent next question in just a few minutes.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
If we're going to think about smart city technology and library development and access, and you could just say one thing, this is the most important thing we need to know to understand smart city technology and its impact on library development and access, what would that be, George?
Yes, no, I'm going to think about that one a minute.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I have an answer written out, but I also see our conversations going a slightly different direction. So give me just 2 seconds to reflect on that.
All right, whenever you're ready, go ahead. Give us an essential point.
I could start if you want. So I think one of the single most important things that we need to know to understand smart city technology and library development and access is just the way that we receive information is changing. And I think that, kind of building off what I was saying about the democratization of knowledge, I think just the way we're receiving information is changing. And since libraries have historically been these kind of central gatekeepers to a world of knowledge, and now we kind of receive more continuous information through personal devices, and it's not just information added in big chunks, you know, whether a big masterwork book or a major study or, you know, like a slower pace of knowledge development or a development of that knowledge base. I think now you're just seeing it's continuous. It's just an ongoing tide of information. And that's just so different than the way it's been in the past. And so I think that we need to understand how we learn in that environment in order to actually think about how libraries stay relevant and grow and become really important parts of smart cities in the future.
That's excellent, Noah. I appreciate that. George, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, because I've not connected libraries with a lot of these things. Let's look at some of the buzzwords of smart cities. Artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, blockchain technology, machine learning, genetic engineering, biotechnology. All these are areas of enormous potential change. And the libraries have not been typically up front because of their structures. Now, maybe they should be, but it's not clear to me how they take a role in something like artificial intelligence, you know, which is basically Watson playing chess.
That's actually why I wanted to have this conversation, because everything that I was reading about smart cities, it was transportation, it was security, it was waste management, it was sewage, it was all these other things. But education was rarely mentioned, and literacy and the availability of knowledge was rarely mentioned. And what you just said is the very reason I thought we need to have this conversation about what's going to happen if we are going to invest, what was it, $30 trillion? Shouldn't we be thinking about how knowledge is going to be and information is going to be part of that?
Right. If I can add one comment to that, for a young person, I'm probably someone who's a little bit more skeptical of technology than most of my peers. But I think that it shows that libraries may need to go the opposite direction as well, really market themselves as an institution that can both provide opportunities to innovate and learn in today's fast-paced world, but also become a place that prizes civic learning and participation in a world outside of technology, kind of connecting you to these broader human questions that technology alone can't solve. I think it's a human world that's connected in a different manner to tradition and the intimate relationships that have made up human history. So I think that libraries also need to be a foundation for that, a place to connect us to things that technology cannot or may actively threaten, things like history, like tradition. You know, I think that maybe libraries become relevant in smart cities by not necessarily participating in all of the technological advances or the mindset of smart cities. It's something to think about.
Absolutely.
They're going to have to find new funding sources if they're going to take on these new roles. Because right now, most of them are funded by the counties. They aren't something that necessarily raise money or have marketing programs or do these things that are out on the edge.
And that is an excellent point.
You can't find an easy connection for why the public sector would put a ton of money behind libraries, which inherently don't exactly make money. They're not built to be like a financial investment. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that, as a public good, I think, gets funded. I think you raised a really interesting question that I don't think we have a full answer to yet. It's going to be really interesting how that turns out.
So, I'm going to wrap us up for part one, because honestly, this is such a broad topic. And a couple of the words that I'm hearing that I really appreciated, George, you talk about smart city vocabulary. And Noah, you talk about this continuous ongoing tide. And I'm not going to give you my metaphor for smart cities, but this idea of tide and navigate might play into it just a little bit. And I appreciate this idea of the smart city democratizing knowledge, whether it be finding a parking space, whether it's in a sewer system, whether it's leveling the playing field in a digital desert, whatever it might be. I do believe we are on the edge of a revolution, and it's time for us to have a conversation about the future of words. And that's including some of these smart city words in our vocabulary. So thank you, Noah and George.
So tune in next week for part 2 of our conversation with George and Noah. We'll continue to investigate how smart city technology affects access to books and libraries in cities of the future. Don't forget to subscribe to the AfterwordPodcast.com. Like us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember that you are welcome to the conversation at our table.